Pull up a chair by the fire. This is Story Night on the Manlihood Mancast.
Hey, Josh Hatcher here for the Manlihood Mancast, and this is Story Night. So, in my time as a freelance journalist, I would get paid for every story that I could find. And I would go to the local diners and I'd say, hey, anybody know of anything interesting happening here? And some old guy would say, well, I heard about this. And then I'd go and I'd try to dig up a lead and try to get a story. I wouldn't get paid unless I had a story to write about. And I didn't get paid much for that. So the least amount of work to find those stories would probably the better. So I remember really trying to dig and trying to find stuff. And one day I came across some old guy that told me that he'd heard that nearby was a guy that was the Guinness World Record stone skipper. And he gave me a name. And I'm like, that's interesting. So I started doing some digging and I could not find this guy. I could find no record of him anywhere. And I kept asking around, and I asked around for months. And then finally I'd find somebody who'd say, well, I've heard of him. I heard he lives out in the woods in this little town, and he lives like in a cabin with no electricity, only comes to town once a month. And then, so armed with that information, I started asking some other people, and somebody else says, well, I heard he's got a post office box. He comes to town and stops in there. So I went to the post office and I said, if somebody had a post office box, but I didn't know the number, but I knew his name, could I drop a letter off for him? Well, you're not supposed to do that. I said, what if I put a stamp on it? Well, you're not supposed to do that. I said, well, here's a letter with a name and a stamp, and it says P.O. Box, and there's a blank. What would happen if I just walked out the door? And she winked at me and says, well, I'm not supposed to do that. And a few months later, I get a phone call. And this guy, it's now wintertime, and what had happened is this guy calls me up, and he's living in another town with a family member because now it's the winter months, and he comes out of the woods and goes and stays with a family member where it's warmer. This guy literally just lives in the woods in a cabin with no electricity, and he goes to town once a month to get whatever groceries he needs. And then when it gets cold, he comes and he stays with a family member. He's not a bum. He works hard to live in the woods and live this kind of crazy subsistence life. He'll find stuff to sell. He'll go hunting ginseng in the woods or whatever. And somehow, for some reason, somebody convinced him to enter the Guinness World Record stone skipping competition. His name was Kurt Steiner, and he called me up and he takes me out to the lake and he shows me how he does it. And I sit there and watch this man who only skips stones from Lake Erie. Now we're a good distance away from Lake Erie at this time. We're in Kane, PA. And so, this is kind of a big deal. He drives and then he collects these stones at Lake Erie so that he can skip them wherever he's at. Only skips stones from Lake Erie because they skip better. And he sits there and we just skip stones and he demonstrates and he shows me how he gets the maximum number of skips across the water. And, I take his picture and I write up a story about him and I publish it and I make $25. But it was really neat to see this. Now, honestly, the guy was dethroned a couple years later. It happens. That's the way Guinness World Records work. There's always somebody bigger and stronger and better at what you do, and that's fine. But he didn't care that he had a Guinness World Record. He thought, well, that's kind of cool. It's interesting. It didn't change the way he lived. And I guess that's what the lesson for today is. Titles and notoriety only mean something if you want them to.
Thanks for listening to the Manlihood Mancast. Please help us out with a like, comment, share, and subscribe. Check us out at manlihood.com.